It's finally here! After 2 years of waiting, we got a new teaser for the sequel to Breath of the Wild. And because I basically entirely gave up on my speedrunning goals, big F on that, I was thinking, why not make a quick video about Breath of the Wild 2? Well, by the time this video is released, all of what I'll say here will be irrelevant because I'm too slow and lazy to make this quickly, but no matter. This video is kind of based off a similar one I did 2 years ago when the original teaser was revealed, so definitely feel free to check that out if you haven't. Either way, these questions aren't in any particular order, perhaps other than the fact that I'll just be getting the bigger, more obvious questions out of the way first, and ask the more curious ones towards the end. With that said, let's get to it. Well, I did say that I would start with the obvious questions. Needless to say, now it's that much more understandable why they picked that timing for the release of Skyward Sword HD, though I would also chalk it up to the game being 10 years old this November, which has been the pattern for previous remasters. That aside, this is to say that floating islands is definitely not new to the Zelda franchise. The first thought comes to Skyward Sword Skyloft and Sky Realm, but we've also had City in the Sky in Twilight Princess or the Palace of Winds in Minish Cap, just to give a couple more examples. Considering that we've seen Hyrule Castle rising from the ground in both the 2019 teaser and the new one, it could be fair to have a first assumption being that these floating islands were raised from the ground in a similar fashion, just like how the goddess Hylia raised a landmass that would become Skyloft from the ground in Skyward Sword. If that were the case, however, we'd notice that the landmarks on said islands would be ones that we could see in Hyrule, which we interestingly don't. The content on those islands is completely unique from what is seen on land, therefore possibly implying that those pieces of land are not necessarily pieces of land extracted from the Hyrule we know from Breath of the Wild that were raised into the sky. Another point that I found interesting regarding those islands is that maybe it's just coincidence with the way the camera work was done in the trailer, but there are no shots in the teaser that show the islands from below when Link is on land. It's difficult to say with any accuracy why that would be the case. Is it just a camera work that prevents us from seeing anything, or is there a reason why the floating islands aren't there yet in those shots? This could support the current theory that's gaining a lot of traction lately that says that the game will actually involve time travel between present-day Hyrule and Hyrule from 10,000 years ago in some shape or form. Maybe those islands were only present in the past. Of course, those kinds of theories are a whole topic in of themselves, so I won't delve too much into it, and we'll just have to see what the story has in store for us. We'll have to see. Either way, let's move on. And another obvious question to think about, we have to wonder what the hell is happening to poor Zelda. The new teaser started off by showing what seems to be a continuation of what we saw in the 2019 teaser where Zelda fell in the hole, seemingly happening potentially after Ganon's awakening. Back in 2019 we didn't see whether Zelda actually had fallen all the way down, but this teaser shows us that this is unfortunately not the case. The last we see of Zelda in this teaser is her falling in this dark, seemingly endless pit. Damn, the Skyward Sword parallels are getting even stronger now. Either way, there's a few possibilities that we can think of most definitely. Could falling down this hole actually be what leads to the past, if those theories are true of course? The idea that falling down a hole will transport you somewhere else is not new to Zelda, since this is how Link traveled from Hyrule to Termina in Majora's Mask. So, could Zelda have fallen in some other realm? It's definitely hard to predict anything here, and anything we say will just be theory material based off complete speculation rather than based on facts. What can possibly be concluded is that Zelda probably will be lost somewhere. Will she just survive her fall and be deep below Hyrule Castle, or somewhere else? Who knows? Or she fell and died. The end. Jokes aside, this once again generated further questions about what the plot will be about. But either way, I'm not too concerned about her. If there's anything we know about the Breath of the Wild Zelda, it is that she's strong. If she could handle keeping Ganon at bay for 100 years, trust me, wherever she is now, she can handle it. She's got enough years of experience in her belt. Speaking of years, I suppose we can move on to the next question. There's not much we can really say so far about this one, but it's something everyone's been wondering ever since the initial reveal in 2019. It could at first be assumed that the game probably takes place a year or two after the original game. However, something I find interesting is that in the few overworld shots that we saw where we could see the OG Hyrule, it frankly doesn't really look any different from how it looked like in the first Breath of the Wild, at least on first glance. That's important to note. We can see that the castle is still very much in ruins, even before it starts raising to the sky, and Hyrule Castle Town is still very much in ruins, exactly like in Breath of the Wild, at least from this angle. You would assume that if a couple years passed, that they would have at least started rebuilding the kingdom. Of course, I wouldn't expect everything to be entirely rebuilt in such a short amount of time, but you could expect to see, for example, that Hyrule Castle Town could have at least been restored to some degree, which it seems it wasn't. Back in the 2019 teaser, it was hard to judge anything due to where the camera was placed, on the Great Plateau, but from what we've seen now, it is implied that things haven't really started being rebuilt just yet. This might perhaps imply that the game actually takes place sooner than we might think, perhaps only a few months after the end of Breath of the Wild. Now, where we have to be careful when treading on this territory is that we haven't actually seen much of how Hyrule looks like in this game just yet. So far, I am only making a few assumptions based on what I've seen, but for all we know, the world has mainly been expanded much more, for example, in Breath of the Wild's populated areas, such as the villages, and just haven't gone back to Hyrule Castle just yet. So this is to say, this has to be taken with a grain of salt. The topic of the overworld is definitely very interesting, however, and with that, I think it is time to look at our next question. Obviously, we already have our answer for at least a part of the new content, with the Sky overworld. However, especially in light of the previous question, I think it's worth thinking about how the OG Hyrule from Breath of the Wild is handled. Up until now, I wasn't necessarily convinced that the game was going to take place in the same world. While it was true that the 2019 interview did state that it would take place in the same world, quote unquote, I chalked it up to Aonuma speaking about the Breath of the Wild universe, if that makes sense, with the Breath of the Wild set of characters and storylines, while that outside shot we initially saw was just a cutscene in the early game. Basically, I just thought that the idea that we're going back to this Hyrule quite literally was just one possible interpretation of that interview, but now we've seen it. Alongside all the new stuff, we also are going back to that land. And actually, this whole section is actually one of my points of concern about the game. As I stated before, we've seen that the land of Hyrule seems to stay rather similar compared to the first game. It doesn't mean there isn't anything new, however. For example, in this shot where Link uses a fucking flamethrower using his arm, it looks like we're inside a cave, which could well be somewhere in Hyrule, and in this case it would be somewhere that wasn't in the original game. If this is the case, it could imply that there could be a bunch of new areas within Hyrule we could potentially explore, but for that we'll have to see. When it comes to the overworld, we've seen Link fight enemies we've seen before, such as bokoblins and moblins, though they seem to have new horns on their heads that are actually grown this time around. When looking at things such as the Stone Talus Fortress here, it seems that Breath of the Wild 2 will find ways to reinvent the enemies we already had in the original game, which really fits with the game's philosophy of having building blocks from which to do anything with. Likewise, Link's new abilities, such as the previously mentioned Flamethrower, the revamped Stasis that seems to allow Link to make things backtrack through time, and his ability to phase through walls could potentially bring in new ways to explore the world. However, it doesn't change the fact that this remains the same world we've already seen and explored for dozens and dozens, even hundreds of hours in the original game. And while those new individual elements are exciting, I'm not entirely sure they can justify entirely reusing the overworld. However, I definitely trust that Nintendo had good reason to do so, and will find a way to make it fun. And besides, it's not like we don't have an entire new Sky Realm to explore that features new enemies and new areas to explore. So, however it turns out, it should be fine. We can trust Nintendo on this. I do have one last distinction that I thought interesting that I'd like to speak about, but it is worth being its own question. So, let's get to it. Something I found really interesting while watching the trailer and then viewing high-res screenshots of the game is that there seems to be a specific distinction between Link's looks between the land and the sky. On the land, Link has his iconic champion's tunic and tied hair, but in the sky, Link has his new outfit with untied hair. Chances are, I probably am overthinking this, and it is just a coincidence. Chances are, it's probably just that this is a new outfit you can obtain in this new Sky Realm, which they therefore wanted to show off in its environment, and tying Link's hair is now part of the customization of Link's outfit. This is most likely all there is to it. However, I can't help but think maybe there is more to it? Now what would that be? That's the interesting bit. While I did try avoiding looking at too many theories since the teaser reveal, the main one I couldn't avoid is one I already talked about, which is the theory stating that the game actually takes place 10,000 years in the past, or at least would feature the possibility of traveling there. And one of the associated theories with that is a comparison between Link's new outfit and the outfit of the ancient hero from 10,000 years ago. In a nutshell, it would state that Link is actually not just a modern hero who defeated Calamity Ganon in the present, but also the same hero from 10,000 years ago who initially sealed Calamity Ganon away. While that is a potential story-wise implication of Link's new outfit, it could be interesting to think about his gameplay implications. What I keep thinking about is that in the original Breath of the Wild, if you're high enough in the air anywhere on the map, you needed warm cloth to basically, well, not die from the cold. Didn't matter the biome, it would end up being way too cold for Link to survive. Now, all of a sudden, we're showing Link being in a very light outfit, just skydiving at heights that are even higher. In the logic of Breath of the Wild, this boy should be a frozen boy. Therefore, I wonder if despite appearances, those clothes could have cold protective stats? Or perhaps the temperature mechanic of the original Breath of the Wild has changed. It is hard to predict at this point in time, but it is interesting to think about. To me, this also makes me wonder where those clothes actually come from. Did they actually come from the sky, or were they obtained in Hyrule? If they do come from the sky, that could imply there are still people living there. There's definitely a few implications here at play, and I'm looking forward to see that revealed once we have the game in our hands. With that said, I shall end the video now. Do you have any questions about the game that you think are worth thinking about I didn't touch upon? Let's discuss it. I have no idea if I'll make more videos in the future or if I'll just restart speedrunning or whatever, we'll see. But in any case, it was my pleasure to make this, so thank you everyone, and bye!